It's weird how Nazis keep turning up to transphobic protests, isn't it?
The neo-Nazis arrived in support of an anti-trans rights speaker.
Those who are against the drag show and decided to protest are gun-toting neo-Nazis, which you will see.
Weird. So, a few weeks ago, fascists organised by Turning Point UK took to the streets of South London to protest a drag queen story hour that wasn't happening.
There isn't actually a drag storytime event happening today.
There isn't one happening. There isn't one today.
They'd looked at the calendar and they'd got their dates wrong, because they're not sending their best, people.
They're not sending their best.
Regardless, when there's fascists on the street, it's only polite to meet them there in great force and tell them to fuck off, which is what we did and what they did. They fucked off. I was at this demo, and the very first thing that anyone could notice from it is that the fascists were absurdly outnumbered. When I arrived, there were maybe 4 of them and probably about 200 of us, but to be fair to them, their numbers did quadruple at one point and reach the dizzying heights of about 16. These are not fascist streets. These are our streets. The other thing that became very, very clear, however, which was much more worrying, is how much transphobia for these fascists has acted as a kind of organising force, bringing together disparate and, one might think, conflicting far-right tendencies under one transphobic umbrella. There were, to be clear, actual neo-Nazis there. There was this woman wearing an Iron Cross necklace, and a man who'd been previously arrested for literally throwing Nazi salutes at far-right rallies. Also, alongside these Nazis was a failed musician and poster boy for men who really don't look like they're taking the divorce badly, Lawrence Fox.
They have put something in the water, they seek a cure for the conversation, they stole a march on your indecision.
They're gonna murder your opinion. They got turned down the light of reason. My wife left me and took the children, 'cause I'm desperate for attention.
They seek to murder your opinion.
By the way, Fox was very, very friendly with the lady wearing the Iron Cross, even hugging her at one point. Weird. Then also there was a vicar fetishist, Calvin Robinson.
You guys mock me, ridicule me all the time.
A man pretending to be a general, a Jewish Zionist wearing an Israeli flag the whole time. My girlfriend, who is also Jewish, almost leapt over the police line to attack him and shouting, "You're a disgrace to the community," in a move which can only be described as the hottest shit. The police were eyeing her up a lot after that. Less so the Nazis. Weird that. Weird. There were also some evangelical Christians there, of course, and there were some women wearing the feminist Women's March, the pussy hats. And all these groups should have tension with each other. They should be fighting. They should be desperate not to be associated with each other. But transphobia here, because they decided erroneously that, I'm pointing to the wider trend of queerphobia, which has been re-exhumed by transphobia. They assumed that drag queens must be trans. And so transphobia was binding them together in a common cause. This is scary shit. This is scary shit. This is why I take significant issue with the tones of reports like this.
The culture wars are bullshit.
Which paint this protest as like an expression of some ephemeral culture war, rather than a means of mobilizing far-right fucking Nazi movements on the street. So, in this video, I'm going to track the ways in which transphobia interacts with long-standing narratives of white racial purity present in Nazi ideology, but also through modern Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But transphobia is not a movement of the far right alone, but something expressed throughout liberal institutions and ideologies too, which are themselves rooted in a capitalist regulation of gendered social relations. So I'm going to also track how transphobia finds a home in liberal feminist or TERF ideologies, which are inseparable from colonial and racial logics, and how those institutions which seek to medicalise, control and eliminate trans people are rooted in similar logics as the far right, which are ultimately expressions of the cis-heteronormativity at the heart of liberal capitalism. That's right, I'm going to murder Lawrence Fox's opinion.
They seek to murder your opinion.
So, like I mentioned, one of the most striking things about the transphobic actions in the UK and across the world has been its clear role in mobilising the far right. I'm far from the first person to have noticed this. Shout out to Judith Butler.
Fuck the police coming straight from the underground.
This is not a coincidence, as many TERFs would have you believe. Rather, transphobia, sometimes TERFs don't like being grouped together with Nazis, They should get used to it though. But transphobia is an inherent constitutive part of far-right projects. It not only interacts with long-standing existing racial politics, but with cis-heteronormative patriarchy, which continues to be essential to fascism. And it's this position of transphobia as both a linkage between fascist racial politics and as an expression of the essential patriarchal gender dynamics that allow it to bring together Nazis, Zionists and so-called liberal TERFs under one umbrella movement. So let's take some examples. Firstly, a narrative which has been pushed by all these transphobes, including the liberal TERFs, who at the pains to deny any relationship to the far right, has been that narrative of groomers. Groomers! Groomers! They're everywhere. Groomers! The transes have been grooming vulnerable children. Look at this Daily Mail headline, "Children put at risk by gender ideology in schools." And this grooming children by the transes is apparently tantamount to large-scale sexual assault. Transphobia for both the liberal transphobes and the far right is therefore necessary for them, for the protection of our children, this notion of our children, a collective our. A Turning Point, for example, had a banner which said, "Groom dogs, not children," which, in this context of sexual abuse, kind of makes it sound like they want to fuck dogs. That's a real fox and hound scenario. I'm sorry about this one. I don't know how well this is going to land. It's Lawrence Fox fucking a dog.
Murder your opinion.
In contemporary Britain, this notion of gangs of grooming predators stalking the country with the consent of an establishment that's protecting them out of some misplaced attempt to remain politically correct or woke is taken directly out of a far-right Islamophobic playbook which fueled mainstream anti-Muslim racism in Britain for years. The narrative of a hyper-masculinist Muslim grooming gangs invading Britain, grooming vulnerable women and children, is a significant mobilising force in the British far right. And part of this groomers narrative has been, much like transphobia, the weaponisation of women's rights as a cudgel to attack an Orientalist construction of an ontologically evil Muslim man. Women and girls are under attack from a force of invading innately evil men who differ from the white normative ideal. Does this sound familiar? And the far right has found immense success with this narrative. It's one which has been taken up and adopted by mainstream liberal institutions and media, and politicians as well. It can be seen through government and police policy, through things like the Prevent Doctrine and the Trojan Horse affair. Two things you should absolutely look up if you hadn't heard of them. It's inspired far-right attacks and the murders of Muslims. It represents a major victory for the far-right in Britain. Just look at this clip from just last week, from our arch right-wing Home Secretary, Suella Braverman.
What's clear is that what we've seen is a practice whereby vulnerable white English girls being pursued and raped and drugged and harmed by gangs of British Pakistani men who've worked in child abuse rings or networks. We've seen institutions and state agencies, whether it's social workers, teachers, the police, turn a blind eye to these signs of abuse out of political correctness, out of fear of being called racist.
And Braverman also invoked women's rights here, saying Pakistani men viewed women in a, quote, demeaning and illegitimate way. And you might think I wrote the description of the grooming gang language after seeing this clip, but horrendously, I wrote this video like a full-on week before the interview went out. And it's fucking wild to see a government minister use hate speech directly from the fascist BNP on Sunday morning TV and face almost no institutional pushback. She's still got her position, she just used a bunch of hate speech on TV, but fucking it's fine, whatever. And unbelievably, after I'd filmed this, while I was editing, up pops Pigman himself, Keir Starmer, himself bragging about how he was one of the first people to actually attack these Pakistani groomer gangs, because the far right affecting arch right wing Tory MPs isn't enough. The Labour Party has to institutionalise it, has to make it acceptable for the liberal left as well. Fucking pathetic.
Including, I was the Director of Public Prosecutions that gave the green light to prosecute the Rochdale grooming case, which was the first of the sort of multi-defendant group grooming cases involving Pakistani men.
And not incidentally, remember that Daily Mail headline? That comes from a report from the government-affiliated think tank Policy Exchange, which only a few months ago published a blacklist of mostly Muslim journalists and early career academics who publicly supported the Trojan Horse Affair podcast, which revealed media and government Islamophobia on like a massive and institutional level. This blacklist had a foreword by the notoriously Islamophobic government minister Michael Gove, and also listed my name, which was an unpleasant shock. Put me on a blacklist, Michael Gove. You're going on my whiteboard. I don't even know if that's a good drawing of Michael Gove.
What about the speech bubble there, where the dog is literally saying, woof woof cowabunga, thanks for the blowjob?
That was meant to be a cherry.
So why would the far right not gravitate to similar causes and narratives as this, which could bring them similar success? But I don't want you to think that transphobia is a case of the far right instrumentally hijacking a project which has certain discursive similarities to the real cause. Rather, what I want you to notice is that the reason there are discursive similarities between Islamophobic grooming gang panics and transphobia, and why the far right is so enthusiastically on board with transphobia, is because both projects rest on a single bed of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. This becomes very clear when you look at the way both groups weaponise the protection of women's rights for their cause. For the Islamophobic far right, this protection is based on a defence of our women, the collective our.
White English girls.
No, it's a protection from barbaric Orientalist hordes of Muslim men coming into the country and not only attacking our women, but disrupting ideals of maternal femininity which specifically reproduce the white race. So there are true women, our women, who need protecting for the purposes of maintaining a strict biological essentialist, patriarchal, white supremacist gender regime. Now this may come as somewhat of a shock to you, but I think there's some similarities to transphobia here. While many liberal transphobes will again balk at the notion that they share a project with the far right, the connections are extremely clear. They couldn't be clearer. While the Islamophobic articulation of protecting women rests on a notion of our women, a national women, white supremacist women, in the transphobic articulation, cis women are presented as authentic women. Women whose authenticity is bestowed through a biologically determined ability to be a mother. The connections here, again, very clear. Authentic women are under constant threat from an insidious, outside force which also threatens the maintenance of a biologically essentialist, patriarchal view of womanhood, which centres, at the very least, the potential for motherhood as the determining, gendering factor. Transness disrupts the biological essentialism upon which both transphobic feminisms and far-right projects rest. But more than just resisting a disruption of biological essentialism, both transphobia and Islamophobia reconstruct a similar subjective position of womanhood, as Bassi and LaFleur argue. In contemporary mainstream transphobia, then, we may be witnessing the post-fascist resurfacing of the crisis woman via representations of trans womanhood as a site of ominous danger and individualised risk. In fact, in the widely rehearsed trans-exclusionary argument, the post-fascist anxiety that degeneracy may lurk around the corner, always uncomfortably and unsafely adjacent to normalcy, and therefore constantly on the verge of corrupting, infecting, or sabotaging it, is coupled with a typically neoliberal sensibility that frames social issues like gender violence as a matter of individual risk produced by a diffused cultural climate of insecurity. Note firstly in this quote how similar the construction of the insidious figure of the predatory trans woman and Muslim man are constructed, and secondly, notice how for this figure to exist requires the creation of a victim crisis woman who needs protection. For transphobes, this isn't just cis women needing protecting from an inauthentic trans woman, but they view the existence of trans men as a means of eliminating women as such, eliminating the category of women. So putting aside the massive contradiction between these two positions, they both share a common theme of women needing protection from an imposed outside force. This is exactly consistent with far-right understandings of women as subservient but requiring protection, which was extremely clear from the Turning Point rally where both the men and the women shouted aggressively about protecting women and children from drag, from scary, scary drag.
And we've seen far too many clips of men dressed scantily as women, gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, dressed scantily as women, gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, dressed scantily as women.
So not only is there a villain created in a similar way, but women in both the transphobic and Islamophobic far-right tendency are similarly subjectified, showing the internal connections between both these movements and maybe indicating it's not two, but one movement. Bassi and LaFleur expand on this, arguing that even as it is making a number of overtures to liberal feminism, mired as they may be in ambivalence and contradiction, the kind of post-fascist feminism we are examining here, gender-critical feminism, explicitly promotes the renaturalisation of the heteronormative sexual order and of the gendered division of labour between men and women. Importantly and unsurprisingly, national and racial formations are also woven through the normative sexual and gender formations that the anti-gender movement sees itself as defending. Alongside its obvious anti-Semitic undertones, for example, the key anti-gender charge that gender ideology is yet another world programme unleashed by global elites on normal families, encodes demographic anxieties and fears about reproduction and ethno-national decline. So the gender-critical or TERF or transphobic movement isn't just creating a female subject that requires protection, but is explicitly harkening back to a biologically determined gender essentialism, which justifies the division of labour, that is, the division of productive labour, which is more socially valued and disproportionately masculinised, and reproductive labour like care work or housework, which is undervalued and feminised. And this is a division upon which capitalism itself rests, as the authors of Transgender Marxism argue. Capitalism as a mode of production requires circuits of circulation, consumption, and social reproduction. Far from a marginal concern, the regulation of gender and sexuality must be understood as integral to capitalism. By reproducing divisions of labour, the regulation of gender is essential for the social reproduction of capitalism itself. And you can see a lot of the particularly strong and fascistic divisions of labour and a lot of the tradwife shit that's tearing through TikTok.
Tradwives also believe that they should submit to their husbands and serve their husbands and family, and that triggers people because the words submit and serve, it makes women think that we're saying that we're less than a man. That's not what we're saying.
It's so weird. It's so weird. Yeah, it's fucked. It's fucked. While many transphobic feminists would outright deny that they're part of a project which fetishizes this division of labour, in appealing to biological essentialism and recreating a particular vision of womanhood, they are upholding the patriarchal order based in a class division of labour. A division that fascists explicitly and zealously want to uphold to a truly ghastly degree.
The women on TikTok aren't inventing a trend, but rather they're partaking in a way of life that is ancient and enduring and battle-tested.
Tradwives also believe that they should submit to their husbands and serve their husbands.
Ghastly! It's no wonder then that far-right Islamophobes find a comfortable home in transphobic campaigns. They're not just instrumentalising transphobia for their own distinct goals, but transphobia is an essential element of their goals. And this perspective, my perspective, finds further support. And another reason I'm right, I am right. Another reason I'm right is that contemporary transphobia shares strong and clear lineages with long-standing anti-queer far-right narratives. I think we all know, without going too deep into it, how the transphobic narratives of groomers and degenerates is just the same fucking tired bullshit that's been flung at queer people for decades.
Public restrooms can often be a hangout for the homosexual. One never knows when the homosexual is about. He may appear normal, and it may be too late when you discover he is mentally ill.
As with the Islamophobic connection, the attack on the homosexualists are derived from a particular normative ideal of the patriarchal heteronormative family, whereby men are men and women are women and they exist to reproduce the family, which reproduces the white race entirely. It's directly and obviously related to biological essentialism, to the biological essentialism of transphobia. So when you've got like gays and lesbians who are also transphobes, they're not only being the most pathetic little pieces of shit around, nothing but contempt for transphobic queers, but they're reproducing the exact conditions of their own oppression out of some misplaced need to appear normal to the people who hate them. It's pathetic. But also, this broader anti-queer narrative also has a clear anti-Semitic lineage, which is, again, very, very present in modern transphobia and obviously within the far right. Not fans of Jews, the far right, it turns out. You can note just how many transphobes, including the liberal transphobes, make direct invocations of a gender ideology conspiracy being pushed across the world by global elites. And this seems to happen weirdly frequently, and has also been used in homophobic attacks for decades. Just look at this Sunday Telegraph article from 1988. Same tired bullshit. For the transphobic expression of this conspiracy, we can look to notable transphobe Helen Joyce's book Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality. Ugh. Get a better title, first of all. Joyce points to several wealthy figures such as George Soros, who are coincidentally all Jewish, weird, as evidence of a global wealthy elite funding trans activism. Suspicious. Suspicious. That. Suspicious.
That's suspicious. That's weird.
Also connected to this notion of a secret conspiracy is the idea that trans women are secretly infiltrating women's spaces, which bears a strong resemblance to ancient anti-Semitic tropes whereby assimilated Jews can secretly infiltrate institutions and gain control. It's like one of the things from which this big conspiracy, one of the bits of logic that upholds the sort of anti-Semitic conspiracism. Again, is it any wonder that the far right and Nazis are lining up behind a movement which is so open and eager to use anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. No, it's not. But again, I don't want to give the impression that the far right are simply lining up behind another anti-Semitic movement for their own experience. Rather, attacking queerness and gender non-conformity has long been a part of far right, including Nazi ideology. And this is in part due to the patriarchal dimensions I spoke about earlier, but also because it's explicitly part of their white supremacist racial agenda. So in pre-Nazi Germany, there was a growth of openness to what we would now call queer culture. If anyone's ever seen Cabaret, you'll know about this. Hello. With the opening of gay and lesbian bars and just a generally more open vibe for queer people. What are queer people up to?
Gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting.
They're vibing. However, if you're here, you'll likely know that some of the earliest acts of institutional violence that the Nazis enacted was destroying the research of Magnus Hirschfeld's Sexual Science Institute in May 1933, which was widely regarded as one of the first trans health clinics. And this was coupled with the closure and destructions of gay and lesbian bars before the arrests and shipping off of gay men to concentration camps, all in the name of creating a clean Reich. Among other things, this should be a warning to anyone who thinks that progress is linear, that we're in a safe place now for all queer people, not just, trans people who are under obvious attack right now, but things can go backwards very quickly. Things can go bad very quickly. And there has been a trend of ostensibly liberal transphobes like J.K. Rowling and Labour Party MP Rosie Duffield downplaying or outright denying that queer or trans people were direct victims of the Holocaust. Usually such denials argue that because queer people and Jews were targeted differently, queer people don't count as victims of the Holocaust. Now, anyone with a still beating heart in their chest can recognise how fucking grim this reasoning is. But it's not just morally abhorrent, it's also analytically shallow, missing key features of the Nazis' white supremacist anti-Semitic project and, kind of downplaying parts of it, which I think is bad. Homophobia was part of the Nazis' white racial project and explicitly a part of the anti-Semitism which produced the Holocaust. For the Nazis, queerness and homosexuality were degenerate imports from foreign Jews who want to feminize society. The attacks against homosexuality and gender non-conformity were a direct part of the project to make a clean, superior, masculine white race. And this white masculinist ideal was also part, not incidentally, of the same eugenicist logic which resulted in the systematic murder of disabled people. It wasn't just that the Nazis attacked gays, disabled people and Jews as separate groups, but that any deviation from the masculinist white racial ideal was attacked. The innate connection there is why gayness or deviance from patriarchal ideals were seen as imports from foreign Jews which had to be stamped out. Queerness was seen as innately tied to Jewishness. Homophobia was innately tied to anti-Semitism. This obviously doesn't mean that the approaches to gays and trans people was the same as the systematic murder of Jews. They thought that you could be cured of gayness, for example, but not of Jewishness. But it does mean that the persecution of gay and trans people is ultimately and inescapably part of the Holocaust. It's an innate part of the logic which produced the Holocaust, and therefore attempts from liberal, not just far right, but liberal feminists to deny and downplay this logic is tantamount to Holocaust revisionism. Again, it is unsurprising that Nazis like this shit. Famously big fans of Holocaust denial. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not calling every transphobe a Nazi. I'm explaining how their transphobia is Nazi shit. And if they think that means I'm calling them Nazis, well, I'll let the Lemkin Institute, named after the originator of the term genocide, explain this.
The so-called gender-critical movement that is behind these laws is a fascist movement furthering a specifically genocidal ideology that seeks the complete eradication of trans identity from the world.
I will never be so reductive as to just call someone a fascist. I'll explain why you're one. But there's one figure from the Turning Point rally that still stands out. Why would a Jewish Zionist feel comfortable amongst all these Nazis? The easy and still correct answer is just to say that Zionism has produced its own fascism, which it has, quite clearly. And it's correct, but I think it's valuable to look beyond it and look at the logics of colonialism which are central to Zionism and connect them to the British racial logics which still characterise many liberal feminisms, and which means that the transphobia of the far right isn't just bound up within far right logic, but expressed through liberal mainstream institutions like the NHS, like political parties, all this shit.
Gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, just scantily as women.
The gender-critical politicisation of a true womanhood under threat by trans politics is not only genealogically coherent with multiple conservative moral panics and resilient fascist tropes, but also with the long durée of liberal, bourgeois, white feminist exclusions perpetuated along racial and class lines.
There's a tendency I see sometimes, which is a reaction to the overuse of the word TERF. Some people point at those who are, obviously not feminists or from a feminist tradition at all and call them TERFs, which is, obviously wrong and lazy. But I think it's led to some people denying that TERF is a category which should be used. And I think that denial is misplaced. People argue that a TERF can't be a feminist because they reproduce certain patriarchal logics and exclude some women from their feminism. And the problem with this is that so many feminisms for such a long time have excluded certain women from it, have excluded women from being part of their feminism. Liberal feminisms have long excluded black and colonised women from the struggle, with even such revered figures as Susan B. Anthony saying that she'd rather cut off her own arm than see black people get the vote before white women. And even some of the suffragettes were straight up fascists. The point here is that when we deny that TERFs are feminists, we run the risk of missing how liberal feminisms, which share threads with far-right mobilisation through transphobia and racism, are able to become powerful and influential within liberal democratic institutions. The relationship between Zionism and transphobia makes this quite clear, I think. One author, Sean, argues that the colonial logic of Zionism, and all colonialisms in my view, create a particular fear of indigenous retribution. It requires the dehumanization of a racialized subject, conceptualizing them as innately violent, flipping the power dynamic between the victim, the colonized, and the oppressor, the colonizer, and therefore requiring firm oppression or even elimination of the colonized. And this justifies both segregation between the colonizer and the colonized, as well as the impulse in the former to destroy the latter. Genocide. But how does this relate to transphobia? Sean argues that in many feminist spaces from which TERF-style transphobia emerged, there was an explicit support for colonialism, whether that was American colonialism or Zionism. The colonial logic of segregation was then innately tied to the transphobic feminism which emerged from these spaces. Victims of oppression were recast as oppressors, and a segregation and elimination logic was produced.
If, in fact, trans people pose an existential threat to cis women and lesbians owing to their inherently invasive and predatory nature, then safety requires their eradication, the elimination of the would-be eliminators.
And I think you can see this quite clearly with all the claims of trans people colonising women's spaces. Trans women are reframed as the oppressor, invading a space. They're seen as violent, in need of segregation or elimination. This is what's really being called for when Labour MPs like Rosie Duffield or the current cowardly, slimy little weasel who's leading the Labour Party right now mean when they say women need separate spaces from trans women. They're viewing trans women as inherently dangerous gender colonists who need to be eliminated.
And again, just as I was editing this video, a new onslaught against trans people came, this time from the liberal institution of the UK's Equality and Human Rights Commission, proposing a review of equalities legislation with the express purpose of segregating trans people. This document plays into all of the things I've spoken about here. It roots gender in a biological essentialism. It frames trans people as gender colonisers within authentic women's spaces, and it justifies segregation. What's more, fucking pigman wet wipe Keir Starmer has again pledged his support of this open attempt to amend equalities legislation to segregate and attack trans people. It's fucking sick.
Note the square ahead. And remember that this colonial logic isn't inherited from the far right and then brought into the liberal tradition, but is a liberal tradition itself, which, because of the inherent entwinement of liberalism and colonialism, has reproduced the exact goals of the far right, the elimination of trans people. This, I think, goes a long way to explain why a Jewish Zionist might be happy to stand with Nazis against trans people. The shared colonial racial logic and its entwinement with transphobia. And I want to emphasise a point here. Liberal capitalism and its colonial logic is constantly seeking to segregate and eliminate populations as part of its methods of control and accumulation, whether that is through violent bordering, keeping migrants and asylum seekers in camps, or through segregating and controlling those who don't conform to its regulation of gendered relations. These logics are not contained within just the far right. Remember the quote from earlier.
Capitalism as a mode of production requires circuits of circulation, consumption and social reproduction. Far from a marginal concern, the regulation of gender and sexuality must be understood as integral to capitalism.
Trans people disrupt the regulation of gender required by liberal capitalism, and so, drawing comparison to colonial subjects whose revolt disrupts its racial regulation, trans people need to be controlled, segregated, or eliminated. This biopolitical or necropolitical control is not just an offshoot of far-right logic, but is innate to liberal capitalism. So while we can draw a connective line between the oppressive medicalisation of trans people from the work of Nazi doctors who viewed transness as a mental disorder, through the British and American uptake of such work within their liberal institutions like the NHS, we have to be careful not to just say that the reason the NHS segregates its service for trans people, in part through the use of such medicalisation, is because of a Nazi legacy. Rather, the reason the work of Nazis found such a ready home is because of liberalism's own segregationary, colonial, liberal capitalist logic, whereby gender and sexuality must be regulated. And this, I think, is why transphobia has become such a gateway to far-right politics. Why outright Nazis are mobilised by it. Why it's so dangerous, not just for trans comrades who are under constant attack, constant threat of genocide, but for all of us. Liberal transphobia, secreted through our institutions, reproduces a logic inside of which Nazis and other far-right ideologies find a ready home. It pushes transphobes to embrace such logic. And I wonder if that's why transphobia seems to just fundamentally break people. It radicalises them into embracing far-right thought, which lies latent within liberal institutions. Regardless, what is clear is that because of the connective tissue between liberal transphobia and the far right, it's become a unifying tool for some deeply, deeply insidious groups.
The anti-gender movements are remarkably diverse. Transgender as a broad set of experiences that may offer an alternative to binary gender roles and the heteronormative family is arguably the chief figuration against which anti-gender coalitions organise. Moreover, in entering what they frame as a global battle of ideas, the anti-gender movement references and repackages a number of often contradictory and incompatible ideologies and theories derived from sources as far-flung as Catholic theology, anthropology, colonial-era ethnography, far-right anti-Americanism, and scientific racism, as well as decontextualised references to post-colonial feminist thought.
Gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, just scantily as women.
So this video got made because I saw this little video from Politics Joe, which seemed to dismiss the far-right mobilisation on the streets of London as some sort of ephemeral culture war issue that we should just ignore.
The culture wars are bullshit. It doesn't matter if there's a drag queen in the back room of a pub. The idea of it is the important thing, over which identity conservatives and identity liberals are able to politically express their values and their opposition to each other.
And what I've hopefully shown here is that this characterisation is just totally false and actively dangerous. Transphobia has mobilised actual Nazis on the street. But more than that, the everyday experience of being trans in this country is engaging with liberal institutions which utilise segregationist and eliminationist logic to attack and control trans people. I agree with the Lemkin Institute and every trans comrade I know that it's a genocidal situation. And I want to stress that I don't see these two features of street Nazis and transphobic liberal institutions as distinct but strange bedfellows. I see them as expressions of the same patriarchal, racial, colonial, capitalist logic, which is why I believe transphobia seems to unite seemingly disparate groups. So, while we should celebrate every time we push these stupid little Nazi weasels off the street like we did in South London, the fight against transphobia isn't just a street fight with Nazi freaks, but a fight against the very foundations of our capitalist society. It's a fight against liberal institutions and their segregation, a fight against the colonial logics and imperialism, and a fight against the regulation of gender by the capitalist logic of accumulation. It's a war we all have to fight.
Well, thanks for watching. This video got me more angry than I thought it was going to. If you enjoyed it, please remember to like and subscribe and comment and share it. And if you'd like to support me more, you can support me on Patreon, or I've got a PayPal and also a Ko-fi. All that stuff's in the description. $10 patrons get their renames read out in the credits. So we'll go ahead, $10 and up patrons I should say. So we'll go ahead and read all those names now. Demo Squid, Dying of Thirst, Nina G, Public Relations, FT Signifier, Lizzie G, Quint Wolf, Kim Crawley, Anita Anispe, Ellis Wren, Sophie, Hey Joe, Cameron Blakemore, TB Skyen, Christopher Poff, Margussie, Daniel Cusid, Joshua Moldenhauer, Tom Price, Kate Zoiré, Esoteric Fictionalism, Shingo, Austin Talman, Paulo Lonergan, Robin, Rachel Mixon, Michelle H, Rich, Niels Abelgard, Tinfoil Pancakes, Kieran Gore, Aga Ghost, Barney Carroll, Joel, Daniel Hughes, J Fraser Cartwright, Aaron, Tamash Kispeter, and Paul Singleton. Like I said, if you enjoy the video, please like and share and all that shit. And if you didn't, I don't know, go fuck yourself. Love you.
And we've seen far too many clips of men dressed scantily as women, gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, dressed scantily as women, gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, gyrating, thrusting, dressed scantily as women.